Welcome, everyone, to the Polarian series of webinars. Today's presentation, Requirements Management Agile, Efficient, Flexible, and Managed Collaboration. Thank you for joining us, and we will commence shortly. Today's presenter is Jerzy Wałek, Vice President, Product Management with Polarian Software. Jerzy works with Agile users like yourself every day, helping them discover the benefits and simplicity of using Polarian solutions to turn complex business requirements into marketable products efficiently and cost-effectively. Welcome, Jerzy.
Hello, everyone. So first, let me introduce Polarian Software. Polarian Software is a leading innovator in web-based requirements management and quality assurance and Aon solutions since our first product release in 2004. We serve companies of different sizes in a broad spectrum of industries. We are a thriving international company with offices across Europe, North America, and a wide ecosystem of partners worldwide. Polarian has created a collaborative web-based application lifecycle management solution with guaranteed traceability, forensic-level links, and accountability. So this is just a short introduction for Polarian. Now let's focus on the Agile requirements. The agenda for today, I will start with a little introduction about Agile requirements, Agile principles in general. Then we will speak about needs and threats of requirement specification documents being part of the Agile process. We cover the need of product documentation. We'll speak about Agile rollout, how easy it is to perform a transition from waterfall to Agile in an efficient and painless way. And I'll finish my presentation with some practical examples of how we were validated for ISO 26262 functional safety standard as we follow the Agile process, and there were some specific requirements once we were being certified by the authorities. Agile methods have been proven their ability to increase project success ratios. The fairly wide adoption of several of them, like extreme programming or Scrum, proves that most of the principles behind the Agile Manifesto are valued both by customers and by developers. So let's just remind the basic principles. First is that individuals and interactions are over processes and tools. We should read it in a way that, there is a value in the items on the right, but the Agile process simply value more the items on the left. So in some cases, for some environments, of course, you need to apply some specific regulated processes, or to use some tools to enable, for example, a collaboration across different departments or simply over the world. Working software over comprehensive documentation, that's very important, that you'll focus all the time on delivery of the working software, and the comprehensive documentation should not be considered as a main goal, or it's simply the focus on motivating developers to focus on the actual value. We can, of course, continue with others like customer collaboration over contract negotiation, or responding to change over following a plan. It's just whenever we will later speak about a requirement specifications or a user stories backlog, a process, we should never forget, that whatever is configured or in place needs to be set up in a way that the change always happen. So these are the basic principles of Agile. And now let's focus on the impact these principles have on the actual requirements management. There are many different aspects how Agile should be followed or software development. You can adopt some principles like continuous integration, frequent releases, heavy use of test automation. But for today's webinar, we'll focus a lot on the actual requirement specification and a major artifact called product backlog. The product backlog is the order list of requirements that defines the product. The items are added to the backlog, are commonly written in the user story way, and the product backlog is what will be delivered, ordered into the sequence in which it should be delivered. I think it's great, the term prioritized was changed into the term ordered, because we all know that we can easily rank requirements as a must-have or should-have, but the actual order of the implementation is more flexible, and it allows us to respect also additional constraints like risk dependencies between the features, or simply some technological constraints. So I think that you all know, what a product backlog is, and you would agree with me that it's very important to have it well structured, detailed enough, and basically it defines if the project will be successful or not. I mean, the good product backlog is really the basic artifact Scrum process. On one side, it sounds very simple. I mean, just to create a list of user stories, formulate them in some specific way. But Agile can actually suffer from the same problem as more traditional methods. This includes issues like that the software quality or non-functional requirements can be completely missed. Or some issues, of course, might be handled better, such as usability, but many minor or not direct requirements are simply postponed as you always concentrate on the minimal marketable feature scope. The common approach is that you defer all the functionality that looks not directly specified by the product owner in the user story definition. For most consumer products, this is probably a fine approach, but for more critical enterprise applications, this can cause a delay of a real deployment. So at the end, I mean, it's against the basic principle to have the working software available as soon as possible. What is missing in the user story definition are some additional details that might be shared between the user stories, like some additional functional constraints, and these are not really the acceptance criteria. They might be small functional details, like in this case, what are the password constraints, is there any username validation in place, or non-functional requirements like security requirements. In this case, in our story, we speak about a user must be able to register an account from a login screen, so there should be probably something that ensures that there is no possibility of cross-site scripting attacked on our web page. And also the story itself doesn't often answer the question why we are doing it. Of course, we can understand the user scenario, but the business context is not really visible by all the stakeholders from the story definition. So definitely there are some clear points that are missing in a basic story definition, and it looks like it would be better to enrich the project documentation with additional artifacts like security requirement specification or functional requirement specifications. But there is, of course, a threat. And the threat is that you waste an effort. Typically, I mean that you can specify what might be implemented at the end, or even worse, what is not needed at all. Or you specify details without understanding the actual business domain or the user requirements, because very often the working software itself, the review of what has been done, gives better understanding and better answers to what you would like to implement in the actual software. Before we can actually answer where is the right balance between user stories and the requirements and in a well-managed Agile project, let me just really formulate some of the differences how we understand requirements and user stories. It's not that the requirements or user stories are wrong, they are just complementary to each other. So in our terminology, I mean, requirements provides a more structured input. It's more structured than just a face-to-face conversation, which is of course great. It's more structured than a Word document that is too big for a granular traceability. It simply gives you some structured input that you can review, rank, and probably also prioritize, not order, so you can easily express whether the requirement is a must or should have. The requirements in general are very overlapping, so you don't really think about the separation, the isolation, but you just simply list all the needs that you need to deliver in the final solution. And what's very important is that requirements are very easy to write. Of course, I mean, we see some approaches to define requirements in a more structural way, or even code the requirements so they are better tested at the end by the test automation. But a very important value of a requirement is that anyone, any stakeholder can simply dump their ideas, thoughts, and needs in a document that is structured. This serves as an input for final implementation. On the other hand, the user stories, they are very focused on the fact that the user story is the primary input for a development team or for the Scrum team, and it drives the implementation. So they should be small enough that they describe a single increment that is ready for the estimation by the development team. They are somehow feasible to implement, again, in some small time unit. And very important is that they are also flat. I mean, you think that it makes very good sense to focus on user stories to be not really overlapping, describing the increments, not hierarchical, and keep them flat just as an order list, because in this way you can estimate your progress much better, and the developers also always know what is the scope of the single user story. Let me give you just a couple of examples of how the user story differ from the actual requirement and how we can link requirements to user stories. That's a representation of the user story in our tool in Plurn ALM. It defines the definition of the user story, and there are additional requirements being linked with the actual story. The requirements are hierarchical. As we said, the user stories are flat, but requirements can be structured however you like. Even more, what is important is that the requirements are being shared from a different user story. So you reuse the requirements across multiple different stories. This can be also understood like the requirements presents a more structured acceptance criteria, or at least gives a better understanding what needs to be done, and just provides more details for developers. So on one side, we can consider that requirements provides just a more structural definition of the acceptance criteria, some more details for the user stories that you would like to share between the user stories. I think there is one additional angle how we can have a look on requirements and think more about the actual life cycle. Let's start now with the user stories and the fact that the user stories are very dynamic. They really describe the dynamic of the software implementation. They really describe all those little increments developers are adding to the product. So they describe really the evolution of the software. So you can more or less easily discard them when they are done, because one story can completely rewrite another story that was implemented a few months ago. On the other hand, so when we speak about requirements, it's very important to think about the life cycle that you should maintain those requirements or specifications even when they are done, especially because, as I said, the requirements are being reused between different stories. So what's the need of this project documentation? Of course, a lot of the actual project documentation happens in the code itself, but we find out that component specification documents ensures better consistency. Sometimes, you cannot really share the code between different protocols, different products, and you really need to ensure that there is a common approach, consistency between different parts of your product portfolio, and that should be covered in the shared requirement specification documents. Sometimes it's also not really possible to reuse the code completely, so the specification allows you to reuse the concepts, the approaches, if they are properly defined. Last, not by least, is that especially for the enterprise applications, the code itself becomes too complex to be self-readable. You really need to provide some additional documentation, some additional hints how to express the function, and not just to manage the code itself. So the summary would be that from our point of view, the user stories are really very dynamic, describes the increments and can be discarded when done, and the specifications needs to be maintained when done. And of course, there is some additional effort to maintain these specifications, and here we speak not about heavy specifications being written in advance, but more about the specifications being always consistent with the code. Let me just have a look how this component specification documents can be expressed in Polarion or in any Agile methodology tool. So we have the user story and some of the structured requirements being managed in the system. And a very important thing about the requirement is that you always think about a requirement in a context, because this context helps you keep the requirements consistent and maintained. So you need to always think about the context of your requirements. Let's just add one additional requirement for our login application, that a passport must contain at least one uppercase letter. And now if we go and we create a new user story, we can consider those component specifications as kind of the library of functional requirements. So if you create a new story, the user must be able to change his or her passport. We can, of course, or we should, of course, describe it in the user story way. So why it should be possible, what's really needed. We should list some acceptance criteria. But then, instead of really typing all the details manually, we should go and just link all the tracked functional or even non-functional requirements from our requirements library, from our component specification documents. So let's just select some of the functional and non-functional requirements and save the data. So now the user story is populated with additional constraints that needs to be followed by developers, and everything is tracked in the system. So let's review the process itself. I was speaking that it's very valuable to gather all the different stakeholders into the process, and they are not really able to formulate typically the user stories in a way that you can directly put them into the product backlog. So that's why you need to import the business specification or EPIC requirements as additional requirement specification documents, and based on that, the user stories are actually formulated. To the user stories that are planned in a next sprint or in the second sprint, you should consider, reviewing the component specification documents, whether they exist or they should be created. And so as a result of a sprint, you don't have just a potentially shippable product, so the actual product increment, but you need to make sure that the product documentation, the component specification documents are updated with updated functional requirements that can be reused by different components or different user requests. And of course, part of the sprint time frame is a backlog grooming, so the product backlog, of course, needs to be updated as well. Let's think about a typical rollout of a transition from a more traditional methodology like a waterfall to agile principles. We have many customers doing an embedded software development coming from the mechatronics business. And the waterfall is definitely, a very traditional process in this embedded software development industry. But what we see is that more and more of our customers are adopting some of the agile techniques, sometimes not requirements-oriented like continuous integration or test automation, but they also do start with adopting some of the agile tech for requirements management. It's not that they don't really perform, for example, the design or modeling phase. They definitely prepare a pretty detailed requirement specification documents. But once it goes for the software development, they really think about the major benefits of the agile development as a definition of the order list of increments. So they adopt this approach of a product backlog to define the order list of tasks, high-level tasks that needs to be assigned to the team and implemented in an iterative way. So they adopt the iterative process, and they at least try to do as little of or as light of the upfront design as possible. This little example of the hybrid process setup as I've prepared for today's webinar. So that's kind of the system engineering project of the system requirement specification for an autopilot project with system requirements and also with electromechanical or software design specification documents, very traditional from embedded system or embedded software development point of view. And now, when we speak about the actual development process, now we shift from the actual requirements being planned into a version plan that contains so-called work packages. A work package is an increment that the development team needs to deliver at the end of the sprint of the iteration. So the iterative development is being in place. And the work package, of course, is fully traced up to a design, software requirements, or the system requirements. So what we accept as a first step in an agile rollout is adopting of the iterative development, where we make sure that we don't plan directly the requirements, because requirements are are very overlapping. You don't care really about this incremental way of specification of those requirements. So that's why you really need to introduce a new entity. And at the end, of course, you include all those additional artifacts like a test specification or continuous integration. So now I would like to speak a bit about our own ISO 26262 validation. The safety standard is primarily targeted for the automotive industry. And as we were trying to help our automotive customers for an easy ISO certification, we decided that we would like to certify our own tool for this process and become marked as a trusted tool for functional safety software development. What we are told by the certification authority is that we were actually the first Agile-based software development company that was certified for this standard. And there were little problems how they can map the regulations to our process. At the end, we found out that we passed pretty easily, and even the certification authority agreed that, the Agile methodology doesn't block at all any kind of the well-managed safety-related process. What we need to, of course, show is some kind of the transition from the waterfall to Polarian iterative process, and how the phases like requirement specification, architecture design, implementation, verification map to our process. And the primary requirement that was specified was to demonstrate that the software units fulfill the software specification and do not contain undesired functionality. We had to prove that the requirements are documented, so it was not enough to have the requirements being just exchanged verbally. We had to prove that the verification scenarios are also documented, and also that the results of the verification procedures are traced up to the requirements. And at the end, to ensure that our product doesn't contain any undesired functionality, we had to prove that the source code changes are verified and traceable. With documentation of our requirements, this was really simple because we are more or less using the same approach that we were presenting today. So we have the user story backlog being linked with additional component specification documents that are very easy to write and manage with our solution. To ensure that every single user story is being properly verified, that's an example of our data structure. So you see the user story on the top and all the enhancement requests that were implemented to deliver this particular improvement in our product, all the issues that were recognized in the context of the implementation of the story, and of course, even all the automated test cases or test automation and manual testing cases are linked and properly visible in our system. Last but not least, the source code traceability, so to ensure that every single change in the software is being traced and recognized in a user story backlog. We see here the list of the revisions, all the changes that happen in our software, and for every change, the revision is being linked with the actual change request issue or user story. So that's the end of our presentation, how to manage the requirements within the Agile development process. Now, if you would have any questions, please, let's go to the questions and answer panels, and I will try to answer your questions if I can. There's a question that in case of a parallel project management, how do you deal with marking requirements verified? Basically, that's a very good question that goes back into my point when I was speaking about user stories that describes the dynamic of the project development and the actual requirements that are maintained even when after the user story is done. Because of that, we recommend not to mark the actual requirements as a done or complete, but we separate the actual verification into test scenarios. So there is traceability from the user story to the requirement, and from the requirement to the actual test case. And the test case contains a record whether it passes or not in a given context for a given release or a different variant of your product. Another question, should the acceptance test be more formulated as a test case and not as a requirement? I think that a very important value of a requirement is that it should be formulated as simply as possible. So there should be no barrier for any stakeholder to formulate any additional requirement that should be considered by the product owner, that should be potentially reused in other contexts. So on one side, yes, a lot of requirements can be also presented by the test cases, by manual or automated test cases in the test specification documents. But a lot of requirements needs to be simple enough to be just formulated as a textual or visual requirement. CO2 support different estimation methods as a story points or working days, and can you mix it in a single project? Yeah, so today we were focusing only on the actual requirements management. We haven't been speaking about sprint planning, release planning capabilities, all the different kinds of estimation. Yes, our Polari ALM solution is fully capable to manage not just the requirements for Agile project, but definitely it includes the full support for planning the releases, milestones, continuous integration, test automation, and of course we include support for different kind of estimation methods like story points or working days. If you can mix it in a single project, theoretically yes, but the problem would be the actual progress calculation, how that you would need to somehow normalize story points or working days to a single unit that we can aggregate to present the progress, the burn up or burn down charts correctly. Do you integrate your requirements management solutions with Jira? Atlassian Jira. There is a connector between our requirements, Polari requirements management module of our AON solution with Atlassian Jira. But let me just remind again that we typically recommend to use our unified solution as a single environment, single UI, a role-based interface, one single repository. This all just brings a better collaboration environment than using two different tools. We have a nice connector between Polari requirements, Polari ALM, and Atlassian Jira, but we recommend to use a single solution for Agile methodology. Second question for parallel project management. For parallel project management, again, should the user story be formulated once or shared for two variants of our software? Definitely, the user story describes the increment. So if you do parallel project management, you do parallel release development, and it means that the increment needs to be implemented twice, then of course the user story should be duplicated. Of course, you can reuse and share all the acceptance criteria or functional or non-functional requirements between these stories, but if this work package represents two different isolated implementation efforts, we definitely recommend to split them into two work items. Regarding the user story process slide, you mentioned sprints, but where in the diagram would the sprints fit in? Basically, the very important thing is that the process is iterative. So every sprint, you need more or less to review all the business input that is coming into your project and review the product backlog, order the product backlog based on the additional user stories that were probably added into the scope. So in this process diagram, definitely we try to highlight that it's not a waterfall-like approach when you first convert your business specifications into user stories. And for the user stories, you write the additional requirements, component requirement specification documents, but it's more an ongoing process. So the user stories do not need to be 100% specified before the sprint starts. It's actually even better, to start with a less detailed definition and collaborate with all the stakeholders, including developers, on the actual update of the component specification documents to formulate the new functional requirements that you might share later in other stories. So rather than think about the high-level process, more waterfall-like, that the first conversion of the business needs into the user stories, think about this as an ongoing process, that the user stories describe a dynamic, the component specifications are the result of the sprint and needs to be updated continuously during the life cycle. These are all the questions we have collected so far. So thank you very much for your attention. The webinar was recorded. We can definitely share, and we will share the recording with you. If you like, we also recommend some of the next steps. We have a fully featured test drive online server where you can evaluate some of the capabilities that we have shown today, or contact us via email and we will schedule a personal demonstration. Thank you again, and stay connected with Polarion.